Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you all for joining in. And a very big thank you to Caroline for coming for the fourth time to this series of Circle webinars. Caroline, I'm sure you all know, Master of Wine, and definitely the go-to expert for anything Eastern European. She has just got such a breadth of knowledge over the whole of Eastern Europe. Today, though, it's quite specific focus, Hungary and Ferment. And it's a very topical session because we're in Ferment February, Ferment fortnight. I think next week is particularly when lots of things are going on. Caroline's giving seminars in London and Edinburgh. And I don't think it's next week, I think it's a bit later, but she's actually talking to the Hungarians about Ferment. So what better qualification could she have? So over to you, Caroline. Tell us why Ferment is so fabulous.
Okay, thank you. Right, I am going to attempt to share my screen. Am I sharing that or not?
You are. You just need to push that's it. Yeah.
Okay, right, jolly good. I think people mostly know who I am. Been traveling backwards and forwards to Hungary since the very early 1990s when I cut my teeth as a junior buyer. Back then I was one of the first big buyers to buy some dry wines from the Matra region particularly, and from Balaton Boglar for the Bass Group, Augustus Barnett for some of you that remember that name from the dim and distant past. So I had some so I was traveling to Hungary at that point, just after the Iron Curtain had collapsed and just at the beginning of the new era. So which I think has given me quite a useful outsider's perspective on how things have changed and the revolution in winemaking that's taken place in Hungary over that time. So, and it's just been such a fascinating journey, as it has been in all these countries in Central and Eastern Europe that I talk about. Hungary definitely regards itself as Central Europe rather than Eastern Europe, I think. And yeah, I mean, I'll show you on the next map where it's located. So this is a little look at the wine map of Hungary to give you a little bit of perspective of the wine regions. So there are 22 wine regions. There are actually 33 PDOs, or OEMs as they are in Hungarian, because some regions have more than one. You know, it's not just, so Eger has Debruy, Harsh Levelou, for instance, as well as Eger. And then you've got PDOs for things like Bicaver in Eger and in Sexard. So anyway, 33 PDOs and 5 PGIs, which are the sort of the bigger. So confusingly, 6 bigger regions, but 5 PGIs registered with the EU. And sort of key geographical features, I think you can see probably better on the next slide. So Hungary, you know, right in the center of Europe and surrounded by, to the east, you've got Romania with that dark green sort of horseshoe shape of the Carpathian Mountains. Obviously to the south, you've got the Dinaric Alps in down into Bosnia and Herzegovina and Serbia. To the west, obviously the actual Alps and the Julian Alps. So it's surrounded by mountains, but I think you can get an impression, I hope you can get an impression of this sort of shallow basin that actually many eons ago was the Pannonian Sea, which was a shallow brackish sea. So so outcrops of limestone were laid down by that. The sort of pale blue region you can see, that's Lake Balaton, which is the largest lake in Central Europe, and then you can see across the country sort of west to northeast, you've got various mountain ranges, and the country's pretty much, it's quite hard to see I think on this map, but the country's pretty much divided into by the Danube before it then heads off towards Serbia and you know, the border between Romania and Bulgaria, which it forms for a long part of its distance. So, but, you know, it may have been the Pannonian Sea, but it's also been very heavily influenced by volcanism. So again, eons of volcanoes. Somebody once told me that the Earth's crust is particularly thin in Hungary, and that's why there's so much volcanic activity. And you can still, I mean, they're all extinct volcanoes now, but you can see the legacy of that in the number of hot springs, something like 1,500 hot springs. And so spas and bathing and swimming and so on are very much part of the Hungarian way of life. You know, there's some fantastic spas in Budapest itself, for instance. So it's definitely something to do when you go to Hungary. It's part of the experience. And obviously you can see the latitude and longitude there. So just a few sort of facts and figures for you to sort of fill in some background. Oh, no, hang on, let's go back one before I lose that. So at one time, Hungary, old Hungary, I should say, you know, in the 18th century, this was the third biggest vineyard area in the world, at over 570,000 hectares. Now, obviously, Hungary became a much smaller nation after the Treaty of Trianon. So partly that was because it covered a bigger landmass, but also partly because an awful lot of what was vineyard land has fallen out of cultivation over many years. So we're down to just over 57,000 hectares of vineyards actually in production, and and then there's probably a couple of thousand hectares of newly planted and so on. And it's about 2/3 white grapes and 1/3 red grapes. And total production's been averaging around 2.8 million hectolitres for the last few years. So it's quite a significant producer. I think worldwide it's something like, I think it's number 8 in Europe and number 12 worldwide. I might have not quite remembered that correctly, but I have that information if anybody wants it. And it's very diverse. One of the things I do find incredibly fascinating about this place is each of these 22 wine regions has its own character. And there are, you know, not far off 200 grape varieties being grown in the country, some of which are totally unique. And interestingly, the UK has actually become the top export market for bottled wines from Hungary. So, you know, arguably we take more of Hungary's better wines than anybody else. I say better wines, obviously I'm talking about, you know, wines in bottle do start with things like some of the supermarket Pinot Grigios and so on, you know, which are big sellers in some retailers. But, you know, it does suggest that British consumers are open to drinking Hungarian wine and, you know, trying some of the more slightly esoteric, off-the-wall things that are less familiar. So what I particularly wanted to talk about for this, this session really was Ferment, because, you know, it's the third most important white grape variety in Hungary and fourth most important overall, because Keck Frankosch is huge, Keck Frankosch being Blaufränkisch. But it's the most, I think it's the most important quality white grape variety, because the two that are ahead of it, Bianca, not really a high quality grape variety, and Kasheka Fuscheré, also the spicy white. It can produce nice wines, but not anything like the quality that Ferment can produce. So the country has put quite a lot of effort over the last few years in promoting Ferment for lots of reasons. Quality, you know, it's a Hungarian original, so it can work as a flagship grape variety for the country and hopefully gather more interest for the rest of the country as well. Now, the main region for it is Tokai. You know, out of the 3,471 hectares, you've got just over 3,300 are in Tokai. But it is coming back into you know, it used to be widespread all over Hungary before phylloxera, and mostly disappeared, but there are pockets that have. So you're finding now small plantings in places like Eger and Badacsony and Tokai, usually volcanic areas, but not always. And then in its neighbours, in order of production or area under vine, Slovenia, Slovakia, Croatia has quite a bit, has about 140 hectares, mostly sold under the label Pushipel. Austria has a handful of hectares and Serbia has 5 hectares. So what it hasn't seemed to have done is caught on anywhere in the New World, interestingly. I think it's been tried and it's not, you know, there are reports of it having been tried in Australia, but with no success. So that's an interesting question for the future. You know, there's a bit of harsh leveloo around in other countries that actually seems to have taken to travelling more than Ferment has. But one of the great advantages of Ferment is that, you know, quality grape, but also you can pronounce it wherever you live, whatever language you speak. Ferment is quite easy to pronounce, whereas its daughter, harsh leveloo, not so easy. So, but I say the main thing is that it's, for me, it's just such an exciting grape variety. So it's a half sibling of Chardonnay, Riesling, Gamay, Keck Francoche, you know, Hornish Weiss was back in the Middle Ages. You know, you've probably heard the story. It was one of the first self-fertile grapes, white grapes with big berries. But, you know, its synonyms were things like piss the bed and the laxative grape. So obviously it didn't taste particularly nice. So there were a lot of attempts to produce crosses that had more interesting characters. And it turns out its other parent is likely to be this rare, pretty much extinct, probably Romanian, but certainly Eastern European grape called Alba imputo-tato. So one of the things about it is it's relatively, a bit like Chardonnay, it's relatively non-aromatic. It doesn't have a very defined aromatic characteristic. So you do get these characters of apple and pear and quince, but quite subtly. And then if you add botrytis to it, it's very prone to botrytis. So if you add, you know, and it's noble rot, you get these amazing array of dried apricot, peach, mango, tropical fruit, quince, of course, honey, all these sorts of characteristics. But I would say the unifying characteristic is this notable acidity. And that's one of the things that makes it so great in the sweet wines of Tokai, which makes them so wonderful, is you get these amazing concentrated, rich wines, you know, often with sugar levels over, you know, 200 grams per litre, but they always have this sort of vibrancy and freshness. So they're never cloying, and it gives them that balance and longevity and that real amazing food matching ability, because you've always got that freshness, that steely vibrancy. And a thing that I'm going to be talking about quite a bit next week is this ability to reflect terroir, to show a sense of place. And this is something that's developing quite strongly in the region at the moment, because, you know, it adds another string to the bow. I'll just go on and talk to you a little bit about the history so you can see why it's important. So a little bit of timeline history. It's a region that's certainly been known for, you know, close to 1,000 years. Royalty had cellars in Tarzel, which is one of the towns just close to Tokai, you know, in the 1100s. Asu starts to get mentioned in the 16th century. popes were drinking Tokai wines also in the 16th century. Then you've got this first mention of these Asu grapes in a written document in 1571. So we've just kind of celebrated 450 years of Asu. Then Ferment from the early 17th century. Then this chap, Mate Laxo-Setchi, seems to have actually documented and developed Asu winemaking as a formal method. And then by the sort of early 18th century, you've got people formally classifying the vineyards according to both geography and quality. And that suggests that already by that point, people were recognizing that certain places gave better quality wines. So then the region was delimited by royal decree in 1737, which made it the second sort of enclosed appellation in the world after Chianti and Carmignano. But arguably it was the first region to classify its vineyards on the basis of quality. And then, it's been more formally documented at various times. Then, of course, phylloxera hits, and then communism arrives, and everything was collectivized, and it really broke the link between land and quality and people. Not as badly broken as further east, but still quite broken because everything was collectivized, everything was about volume. That was an era when things like fortifying the wines to preserve them, like heat treatment to preserve them, all came in and kind of destroyed what we think Tokai had been all about in the past. But I think the thing is that, there's been this very long history of connecting quality and place in this region, and Ferment has been at the core of that because it's the first of these local grape varieties to be mentioned. It's still about 70% of the Tokai region, and it's key to this region and this sense of place that these wines are showing. So then 1991, new era of privatization, and that's when the new face, maybe the new old face of Tokai starts to develop as foreign investors come in because they recognize this as one of the great vineyards of the world. So you have people like Aximilizimes moving in, you have people like Pablo Alvarez of Vega Sicilia moving in, and then you have private individuals as well who've got a family history or a legacy or just a passion for the wines of the region. So it's been such a dynamic place from there to here. And that move has continued. So a little bit more about the place. Good question, Rose. Ferment as climate warms. Sorry, let me go back one. Been asked by Rose. It's a good question. Still to be discovered, really. It's a bit more drought tolerant than some of the other grapes in the area. It does cope with some of the very well drained stony soils at the top of the hill. But we have to wait and see, really, because there is no irrigation in the region, and many of the vineyards are just too steep and stony, I think, to feasibly have irrigation. So it will depend quite a lot on, understanding the different bits of soil, looking for the vineyards that maybe have a bit more clay and a bit more water retention. So I'm going to talk about Tokai really quite a lot because it's the core of where Ferment is. It's one of 6 authorized grape varieties in the region, but it's about 70% of the region. And this is a region of about 380 extinct volcanoes. And the volcanic bedrock, then all those, the rhyolites, the andesites, the dacites, and then you have the metamorphic tuffs and outcrops of things like zeolite and perlite and kaolin that have all been mined at various points in Tokai. There are some quite shocking mines in the middle of these World Heritage vineyards, to say. And then over the top of that, you have these main soil types. You have this red clay from the weathered volcanic rocks. You have the loess, which is this very fine windblown silt, often with very fine clay in it, sometimes with sand in it. And then this rock flour that is doesn't have much water retention capability. So the rock flour, this very powdery white soil, that's probably the area that's going to suffer most from the drought first, because it doesn't have the water retention that clay, the loess and the red clays have. So just to run through some of the typical wine styles. So you've got this development of dry wines that has come along. Really, the turning point for dry wines was as recent as 2000, when Istvan Szepsi first made a serious quality single vineyard dry wine from a vineyard called Oraya, which means God's bed, which is where the sun sets from the village of Mard. And then 2003 was a really hot dry vintage. And at that point, several of the big names were absolutely adamant that they weren't ever going to go into dry wines. Sweet wines was what the region was all about. But then you had this really hot dry vintage in 2003, when there was pretty much no botrytis, little bit, but not very much. And people started to think that maybe dry wines would be a good way forward. And it turns out that Ferment is very good. It makes really amazingly good dry wines. It can either be made on its own, or it can be a blend. Any of the 6 permitted grape varieties can be made on their own, but Ferment by far the most important. And there are different styles. It may be aged in stainless steel for these kind of fresh, young drinking styles, or it may be fermented and aged in oak. Hungarian oak, again, another topic I can talk on at length, because the quality of oak in Hungary is very good. But I'll talk about that later if anybody wants to know, really. And most people now use this distinctive special bottle that you can see in that picture. At least for the quality wines. I have to say there is still some rubbish being made in Tokai. We don't see it in the UK, but if you go to a supermarket in Tokai, or you go look at what's being exported to Poland and that sort of thing, there is some not very good wine, which really doesn't help, I think, the region's image. But at the moment, at least, a third of Tokai's wines are still being made by the state winery. And again, politics I could talk on for some way, but we'll leave that till later on if anybody wants to know. So, core of this subject, you've got these incredibly complex soils in Tokai, because you had different eras of volcanism, and then you had all these geysers and hot springs that kind of stirred up the rock as well. So you have incredibly complex volcanic soils that can even vary within a vineyard. So you've got these vineyards that were classified, back in the 18th century. And those classifications are still being used. So, there was something like 53 first-class vineyards, 2 great first-class vineyards, and so on. And many of those top vineyards are still the top vineyards today. But what we're finding is, so it goes 2 ways. One is the personal experience of the winemakers are seeing now, because they've been working in this way, looking at producing quality dry wines for a few years now. They're seeing which vineyards and which bits of the vineyards are best. Because what you need if you're going to make quality dry wine is you need to think in a different way about your viticulture compared to if you want to make sweet wine, you want rot. albeit you want noble rot, but you want rot. So you need humidity for botrytis to get going and to be able to punch its way into the grape skins and develop noble rot. If you're making dry wines, you don't want rot. So you want the drier soils, you want the higher ones, the rockier ones maybe that have less humidity, you want the breezy sites so the grapes are healthy. And so there's quite a lot of research now going on to try and quantify and research the science behind those differences that I think winemakers are seeing and are very connected to in person. So, you know, there are people finding differences in terms of, you know, berry skin thickness in different vineyards. There are different responses to different pHs in the soils. There are, and even within the vineyard sites. So there's a big project going on that I've, you know, it's still secret, but anyway, I've seen it. And this research is comparing, you know, the mineral uptake in the grapes between these two first growth vineyards, St. Tomasz, which is regarded by many as one of Tokai's very best vineyard sites, often makes the most long-lived wines in Tokai, and Becek, that makes some of the most structured, intense wines. And you can measure different minerals in uptake in the grapes. Now, I don't think anybody understands really how that connects to what we taste and whether there's a direct connection to what people describe often as minerality in their wines. But we can certainly now see that the soils make a difference to the composition of the grapes. And it even varies within the vineyard. So that research is going on. But I say this is still, dry wines are 20 years old, you know, and they've had to go through this phase, first of all, of understanding the winemaking, because there was definitely a move in the early days of dry wines to pursue massive alcohol and lots of oak and maybe full malolactic. So you had these things that were 15.5% alcohol, full malolactic, lots of oak, you know, which might impress and might show a difference to the previous era. But I think now people are now being more restrained, the oak use is better, the quality of the oak's better, and the elegance of the wines is better. So I think why single vineyards are important. So, I mean, you can see from the picture there that it's a very dramatic region with all these little extinct volcanoes. That's the Tokai hill itself in the background, these very rocky soils. You can see the bottom of the picture. So 52 vineyards were defined as first class, and there are all these 418 different duleux, which I haven't pronounced correctly, but I'm not far off, which are these crus or vineyards. So there's certainly a question as to whether the region needs a new classification for dry wines, because say some sites that are great for sweet wines may not be great for dry wines. So that's a thought process that's going on at the moment. And then you've got climatic differences as well. It's a long region from the far northeast, right on the border with Ukraine and Slovakia, where it's really quite cool, all the way down to Mad, which is warmer. And I would say generally in other parts of Hungary, Ferment does best on volcanic soils. There are occasional examples on limestone, but mostly volcanic soils. But it's different volcanic soil. It's basalt in Balaton and in Shomlo and Badajon. So it definitely has, you know, if you get the chance to taste Ferment from these different sorts of volcanic soils, there are differences. You tend to get quite firm structured wines off basalt, for instance. So kind of little map of the villages of Tokai, starting down in the Tokai hill itself. And important to see all the rivers that run along. So the vineyards tend to be on the side of the hills, the Zemplen hill range. So you get this great air drainage off the hills. And then you've got to the the sort of east of that picture, you can see all the little rivers and the big rivers. Two rivers, the Bodrog and the Tisza, actually meet in Tokai itself. But all these rivers and this floodplain below the hills creates this humid, foggy. I mean, it can be incredibly foggy on an autumn morning, which gives you the opportunity to have this humidity for noble rot. So in terms of the sweet styles, and again, Ferment is kind of really key ingredient in these wines. So you've got the simplest, the late harvest wines, which are mostly, but not always, you know, it's just they're late picked. They may not have Botrytis. They could have Botrytis. And there certainly have been famously some very amazing cuvee wines, late harvest wines that have been made with similar levels of sugar and concentration to the Asu wines, but vinified in a different style for the aromatics and the freshness. So you get a couple of categories of late harvest wines, which we've made from grapes from the kind of the left-hand side of that picture. You see that little lineup of how grapes change with the arrival of noble rot. So the first two are your kind of late, where we're looking for late harvest. And then you have this category of Zamorodny, which is a Polish word meaning as it comes. So the Polish have always been big customers for Tokai wines, and particularly in the 16th and 17th centuries, before Asu had really developed. They were huge customers for these wines. So with Zamorodny, you have whole bunches that will have some Botrytis berries. So they pick the whole bunch and don't select out the Asu berries. And it comes in two styles, sweet, or very rarely, there is a dry style that's made with floor aging. And those can be just astonishingly amazing wines. I know people have said to me they find it quite confusing that Zamorodny comes in these two styles, but I think in practice, the dry styles are so rare and quite expensive. Most people are not going to come across them unless they're looking for them. So Zamorodny has kind of come back to the fore in the last few years. So the rules were changed quite dramatically in 2013, and they got rid of the lower categories of Asu. So you used to be able to make Asu as 3, 4, 5 or 6 Petonios. So they got rid of 3 and 4 Petonios. So the less sweet styles were banned, practically banned. So the minimum sugar level for the Asu styles became 120 grams per litre, which is the equivalent of 5 Petonios. A Petonios being a harvester's bucket. It was a 27-litre bucket that you pick these Asu berries into, which I'll show you a picture of in a minute. And the number, so back in the day, the number of those buckets of these shriveled Asu berries that you added to the base wine got you your sweetness levels. Nowadays, it's done, you know, by measuring the sweetness and the balance of the wine. But and then you have this essentia, this trickle of syrup from Asu berries, which barely ferments. Now, hopefully, I've got a couple of pictures to show you. So this is a picture of this Asu berry. Now, the thing about Asu berries is that this combination of foggy mornings that creates Botrytis or enables Botrytis to get going, and these sunny autumn afternoons with breezes off the mountains means the grapes really, really shrivel up. So you can't just squeeze them for juice like you can in, say, Sauterne. So hence the development of this special method of winemaking, where these Asu berries are picked individually and then they are soaked. Well, they're crushed by foot or through rollers, and they are soaked in either fermenting must or young wine for sort of 12 to 36 hours typically. And this is a typical scene at harvest. You know, the workers are often older women who will go through the vineyard probably 3 to 5 times during the harvest, picking these incredibly shriveled berries out of the bunches. And a box like this, you know, they can pick 10 to 15 kilos a day. So it's incredibly labor intensive, but it's also how you get these amazing wines. Now, if you were making Zamarodny, you might pick a bunch like this one in the middle as it is and pick the whole bunch. So you've got some healthy berries and some Botrytis berries. But if you're making Asu, you're picking out these very shriveled Asu berries, which then will go to the winery to be made into Asu wines by this process of soaking that I just mentioned. But you can imagine labour is an interesting question, because some of these women are literally, you know, they're dying out, they're retiring. You've got to be, if you can see in the picture behind me, that's the highest vineyard in Tokai. That's the Old King Vineyard. And I tell you what, it's bloody steep. I've climbed up it. I tried to run up it. You can't. You've literally got to climb up it. And you actually need to be quite fit. So there comes a point where some of these retirees who are just supplementing their pension to pick some grapes are retiring, literally. So again, that's another topic I could talk on, is how different wineries are solving the problem of getting enough labour to do this very labour intensive harvesting, because these vineyards are too steep for machines. Even if, you know, machines are allowed for certain styles of wine now, but you can't use them for making these top wines. And this is what you end up with, this golden elixir. So once you've, you know, soaked your Asu berries in your fermenting must or your finished wine, and the decision about that will vary with the quality of the Asu berries, how clean they are. For instance, if there's any grey rot in there, for instance, wineries are more likely to use young wine because it doesn't extract so strongly. So there are all sorts of factors like that for wineries to take into account when they're choosing how to make their Asu wines. And then after the maceration, after that first maceration of the grapes in the young wine or the fermenting must, the juice will then usually go into a barrel, which will either be a 225 or a 500 litre or maybe a 300 litre barrel, usually to finish its fermentation in barrel and then to be aged in barrel. So with Asu, it's a minimum of 18 months in barrel, but again, it's a winemaker's choice as to how long. And I think the minimum now in Zamarodny, which I should have on the tip of my mind, it's either 6 months or 9 months, so that you've got some of the Tokai character, but the wines are much fruitier than they used to be back in the old days of Zamarodny, when it had to be in barrel for a long time. I think the wines are much more approachable, much fruitier, still bottled in the classic Tokai bottle, which a lot of producers like, and a lot of producers feel that modern Zamarodny is much more authentically Tokai than late harvest wines, which are not usually in, well, they're not in a Tokai bottle, they're either in a flute or a little Bordeaux bottle. Most top Tokai wines 100% ferment. Yes and no. I mean, I think a lot of the single vineyard wines, Wink, would be, there's a lot of emphasis on ferment for those top dry wines. Having said that, there are a number of producers who believe that actually promoting ferment is a mistake, and what we should be promoting is the region. but so there is a debate about that, but I think more people are behind the Ferment method. And if it says Tokai Ferment on the label, it has to be 100%. If it says Tokai dry on the label, it could be any combination of the permitted grape varieties in the region. There are a number of really fantastic single vineyard harsh levelus, which I did a masterclass on last year, which are well worth seeking out. And Zamarodny, again, I would say quite a lot of them would be a blend of Ferment with some harsh levelu, possibly some muscat. But again, there are a number of them that are now 100% Ferment, particularly when people are sort of really focusing on vineyards. So we're seeing quite a few top Asu wines and Zamarodnys as pure Ferment wines as well, with that lovely zingy acidity. And Ferment is much more prone to noble rot than harsh levelu is, for instance, as well. Zamarodny, literally as it comes, I mean, it's because it's how it comes from the vineyard as a whole bunch. And yes, it will vary every year, because there might be different blends of grape varieties. There might be some years where there's more Botrytis in the bunches of berries. So again, that will be a winemaker choice as to, what percentage of Botrytis in the bunches that are picked. So I'm not sure that it's more manipulated in the winery. I think it would be more about the choice of what comes in from the vineyards, Nick. And so I think it's still quite a winemaker preference. How much Essentia is exported? I mean, it's a very, very tiny production. It's a few hundred bottles, because and quite a lot of wineries don't even separate it. There are a few that bottle a little bit. They ferment it in these, I mean, I say ferment, it barely ferments in these glass demijohns, and it can be incredible levels of sugar. I would imagine that there is some going to Japan. I can't imagine. Royal Tokai, for instance, is one of the wineries that does do an Essentia. Famously got 100 points for it off Wine Spectator or somebody like that. And I can't imagine that they'd miss the opportunity to export it to somewhere like Japan. But I would have to ask them. Do wineries commonly make both styles? I think I am just racking my brains on that. I can think of quite a few wineries who make Zamarodny and Asu, and I think for a lot of people, particularly, if they want a more entry-level sweet Tokai product and they want it to be authentically Tokai, Zamarodny fits the bill for many wineries. But there are wineries that do all three, late harvest, Zamarodny, and Asu, and probably some dry wines, and possibly some sparkling as well. I haven't mentioned sparkling. This is a new trend, and one that's producing some amazing results, because it turns out that Ferment, with that acidity and with its relative neutrality in the sort of Chardonnay direction, is amazing base wine for bottle fermented sparkling wines. And there are some just delicious Tokai Pezgő, based on Ferment, and in Somló and one or two other parts of Hungary as well. Margins, yes, I think that's a good question, Meg. I think that dry wines are considerably cheaper to make, because, as you can see, that a box of Asu berries like that one in the picture, that's 2 days work for somebody so there's a huge cost involved in making Asu wines, but it's only about 5 to 7% of the region's production. And the thing about the dry wines is that they're cheaper to make. because you can harvest bigger volumes from the vineyards. So, you know, Asu berries might be 1 or 2 tons to the hectare. Even the lowest yielding top dry wines are probably more like 3 to 4 tons to the hectare, and some of them will be 6 to 7 tons to the hectare. So the economics are quite different for dry wines, and more people drink dry wine on more occasions, probably in larger volumes. You know, sweet wines tends to be a glass after a meal, or on a special occasion, even though they can be amazing throughout a meal. But Angela, minimum alcohol for Essentia, I think I have to look up the rules, and I do have the rules, and I can't remember. It might be 1.5%, but you'd be lucky to see it. It never gets over about 3.5%. But I'd have to look up the rules. I'm sorry, I should know them off the top of my head, and I've forgotten that one. Style and taste differences. Yes, I would say Pushapel from the Croatian uplands, certainly in my experience of tasting those wines, is that they are very, they're quite delicate and super crisp, really, you know, appetizing, with this really zingy, zesty acidity about them, usually lighter in alcohol than I would say the majority of Tokai dry wines, probably more 12.5 to 13.5, maybe 14%, 14.5, whereas the Pushapels that I've been tasting have been more around the 11.5 to 12.5 sort of mark. More and less oak use, I would say, more kind of focusing on that fresh vibrancy for most of the Pushapel producers. So yeah, I think that would be the main difference for me in what I've seen so far. Yes, all Tokai sparkling has to be traditional method as of about 3 years ago. I think they changed the rules. So there are Sharmat wines being made in Tokai, and they can be delicious, but they have to be sold as PGI. So if it says Tokai on the label and it's Pezgür sparkling wine, it has to be traditional method bottle fermented. Right, I'm going to stop my share now so I can see everybody's faces. And any more questions? Yeah, have I answered everybody's questions? So, oh, clear glass I was asked about. That's a good question. I don't know. Maybe it's, I mean, it's traditional. It's been clear glass for forever, even if you see bottles, which you occasionally do, back from the sort of, there was a release of some wines from 1956, obviously, to celebrate an important milestone in Hungarian history, and that was all in clear glass. So I actually don't know why it's in clear glass. I'm going to have to ask that. So that's a good question. The dry wines are mostly bottled in quite dark green glass though, and the sparklings too. But yeah, don't know why clear glass. Maybe it's to show off the golden color, but it's a good question. What else did I? Yeah. So
I think Rose had a question.
Well, I had a couple of questions actually. What first of all was that the sparkling wines that are now being made from Ferment, but outside Tokai. Do you remember we were talking about this? Do they there's no restriction them having to be traditional method?
Not as far as I know, but I'm going to have to ask the question as to whether if it's PDO. I don't know if Sue's still here. I don't know whether you're any more familiar with that. So I'm not sure whether all PDO Pezgür has to be traditional method. So that's another one I'm going to have to find out. I like this when I have questions. I've got to go and ask people.
And then the other thing I was interested in is that the closures that they use. Some are using screw caps. You know, what sort of proportion are you in this? I mean, obviously talking about really Tokai. Some are using screw caps, some cork, and some glass.
Yes, that is an interesting question. I mean, I think that again, people are experimenting and working out what works for their markets and for the styles of wine. So there's certainly some of the more entry level, sort of fresh, easy Tokais, Furmints particularly will be bottled with a screw cap. Then I think the slightly more serious ones, you'll see a mixture, quite a lot of natural cork still, 1 or 2 people using technical cork, and a few using glass. I know 1 or 2 people have expressed a view that they're a bit concerned about the longevity of glass, because the glass is fine, but the silicon seal that seals the vino lock into the bottle can break down after a few years. So, but certainly I think for the wines that are destined for long aging, more serious assays, I think cork would still tend to be the closure of choice for people.
Could I ask a bit more about this research on the mineral content of the grapes? It's fascinating. And you say it's a secret project, or it hasn't been released yet.
No, it hasn't been released yet. It's one of the top wineries, I think, is involved in it, because I mean there's quite a lot of research going on various aspects, but what they are doing particularly is looking at these 2 vineyards and another one between the 2 vineyards as a kind of control, and looking at analysing the grapes, looking at the different pHs of the grapes that they're getting, the different uptake of some of the smaller metal ions, calcium, cobalt, copper, all those sorts of things. And then of course, but you've then got to connect that to what the implications are for the taste of the wine, really. Because we talk an awful lot about mineral wines and minerality in our wines now, and grapevines clearly can take up different minerals from the vineyards, but how that connects to what we taste, I think, is still quite hard to define. And then you've got other complications like the fact, water availability also has an effect on, so it's not just mineral uptake, it's water availability as well. It's the pH of the soil and calcium levels in the soil might have an effect on the wine. So there's certainly a view being expressed that, for instance, loess, this fine silt that you find all around the Tokai hill itself, produces kind of lighter, more delicate, sort of slightly softer, silkier wines that you can drink a bit younger than Ferment that grows on some of the harder, stonier volcanic rocks, say around mud. And that might be to do with clay content, it might be to do with the pH of the soil, because mud soils average 6.3 and the loess soils in Tokai average a pH of 8.4. So that's going to have, that factor alone is going to have an effect on the bioavailability of and the ability to move through the soil of some of the minerals that vines will uptake. For instance, phosphorus is famously very static. So things like soil pH will have an effect on what you end up with in your grapes. And then you've got the clone research to add to it, because of course the 2 most common clones were developed in the 60s and 70s, and they were all about yield, because that's what they wanted in that era, was quantity. So again, there's a lot of research going on, sort of selecting clones from some of the old vineyards, because there are still 100-year-old vines in some of the vineyards. And so there's quite a lot of research currently going on about finding better clones for dry wines that have smaller berries and looser bunches, so that they're less prone to botrytis. Right, thanks, Sue. Minimum aging 6 months for Zamarodny, and yes, Neil, that it is a really good point about geological minerals and nutritional minerals, which people get I think lay people get quite confused about. But anybody wants to read Maltman, he's very good on the subject of mineral uptake in grapevines. So
Zvonko had his hand up. I'm not sure whether you've answered his question already or not.
Yes, I'm ready. Thank you very much. Regarding the style and quality of the Tokai wine, what do you think about Šipon from Slovenia or Moslavec from Croatia? Is it far away in quality and style, or?
Well, I think that certainly in Slovenia, I would say there are some really amazing wines now being made by people like, you know, Michael Gross and a few people who've really identified amazing single vineyard locations and slopes and so on, and are paying it real attention. But I think they for the most part, Šipon, which is the Slovenian name for Ferment, has been very much treated as a workhorse grape. Again, volume, you know, litre bottles, bag-in-box, that sort of thing. So I think they're a bit behind the curve in giving it the attention it needs to produce amazing quality, but it's getting there. You know, some amazing single vineyard wines being made by Puklovets. So Michael Gross is making some amazing wines. Fantastic sparkling ferment as well he's making. Bojan Kobal, you know, so there are a few people worth exploring, but I think Tokai's been doing it for a bit longer. I think Slovenia, with the right clones and with the right attention to detail, can do it, but it's a bit further behind in the process. And again, Pushipel in Croatia, I think the wines that I think of necessity at the moment are lighter and more delicate, because that's what the climate and the region is giving them. Again, there can be some delicious wines, but again, I think a little bit behind the curve. I think they're working very hard on it, and they're working. And what's good in Medjugorje is that they've got a group of producers who are really working together and sharing ideas and doing tastings together, which is, you know, really encouraging to see as well. Yes, the oddity is the dry ferment from Royal Tokai, who are one of the wineries who were adamant that they were never going to do dry wines, but they do now, and they do some very good dry wines. And the oddity is one of their more entry-level wines that has that kind of Chablis character, like steely, you know, sort of mineral saline backbone to it. And then I think one of the things for me about Ferment is it has these different aspects. So sometimes it seems to channel Burgundy with these complex layered, you know, more textural, more usually oak fermented wines. And then you've got these more steely, from more acid driven wines from maybe from the cooler vineyard areas that kind of channel a bit more of the Riesling side of its nature. So I think you get to see a bit of both. And the one thing I haven't said is that good ferment can just be delicious, you know. All these other things are interesting, but, you know, it's got to be nice when you open the bottle, right?
Can I just ask something which might be a bit controversial, but a lot of the sort of marketing support from Hungary is going behind Tokai and behind Ferment. And is there a little bit of jealousy maybe from other regions that feel that they're being left out?
I couldn't possibly comment, but yes.
I mean, I'm just interested, because obviously it's their flagship grape, but it seems a little bit unfair on others who are, you know, maybe doing really good wines in other regions.
Well, yes, I mean, I think the Tokai producers are really quite well organised and work well together. You know, the Tokai Regional Council is very dynamic. And it's a very important region for Hungarian identity. And I think a lot of people see an opportunity to use Tokai to kind of leverage attention to the rest of the country. But yes, I would say there are other regions that probably do feel they don't necessarily get their fair share voice, but it's very deprived. It's a very poor part of the country, and there's not a lot else there. So it's kind of strategically and politically important to provide a living, to support rural living, to in Tokai as well. So that's one of the reasons why it's had quite a lot of money. And of course, the only state-owned winery is still what is now Grand Tokai, which is producing an awful lot of the region's wine. So again, politically, it's kind of important. But I know there are other regions who feel in its shadow, but you know.
But it's a foot in the door, presumably. They hope that
it's a foot in the door. If it gets Hungary on wine shelves, on wine lists, into people's glasses, and they enjoy it, then hopefully they will then explore what's next. The Kek Frankoshes, the Kadarkas, the Keknielus, that all can be amazing, but you've got to get people drinking and enjoying and connected to Hungary. And for me, I feel Ferment is a really strong message. But I mean, I love the reds, Kek Frankosh and Kadarka. I also feel for, you know, really fit the zeitgeist of today's drinking, because they're both quite acid driven. They're not huge wines. They have that freshness about them, and they have this ability to go with rather than dominating food. You know, if you've got a big hefty barrel fermented Merlot, you know, it's finding things that are a point of difference to put Tokai on the map. And you know, Ferment is firmly there as a leader in that message, I think, and hopefully we can spread out from there.
That's brilliant, Caroline. Thank you so much. You've really well, as you say, you've helped to spread the word for Hungary and Ferment in particular. So we're very, very grateful for so much information. And as you saw from the questions, a lot of good response from people attending. Hopefully we'll have you back again in a little while to talk about perhaps some of the red varieties.